Welcome to The Writer's Dream. This is a show where authors can talk about their books, how they write them, how they publish them, and how they market them. We have a Facebook page called The Writer's Dream. If you have a question for us, we would be happy to answer your question. Just message us on The Writer's Dream. And also we feature a different writer from the show every so many weeks. So if you're interested in writing, if you're interested in being on the show, please visit our Facebook page. Our guest today is Detective Lieutenant John Nolan, Homicide Squad Commander from the Nassau County Police Department. And he is here to tell us about his books that he's written about some very interesting cases he was involved in. So tell us a little bit about yourself, John.
Well, I was in the Nassau Police for 24 years. The last 9 years I spent as a supervisor and as the commander of the Homicide Squad. As a result, I was involved directly or indirectly in all of the cases. I had responsibility for them. But I was surrounded by very competent people, as you can imagine. Homicide detectives do not get there by accident. And the sergeants are just as well capable. So I had good people to watch out for my back, as the saying goes. However, I still had to take the direct responsibility. I was in charge. And during all of that time, I also inherited the squad during the crack epidemic. So we had murders galore. I look at the statistics today, and there's nothing compared to then. That doesn't mean that the guys still don't work hard. It's a difficult, challenging profession. However, I decided to take some of the cases and either turn them into fiction or create fiction, or as in the one over my left shoulder here, is based upon a true story. But I can take them one at a time and tell you how I got to them and what made me start writing, if you like.
Before we get to the books, could you tell me what it takes to be, if you're a policeman and you want to become a homicide detective, what do you have to go through? What kind of hoops do you have to jump through to get there?
Well, it's not only a collection of hoops, it's also experience.
Okay.
And one of the attributes that most homicide detectives have is they're great interrogators. Mm-hmm. That's their single most thing. Everybody can write a report, everybody can do a crime scene, but it's that one-on-one in the room with a guy or a woman. More women now commit murders than used to.
Well, equal rights.
And get them, and get them to fess up to what they did and why they did it, and most importantly, where's the murder weapon, what they do with it. Mm-hmm. So it's a very challenging thing. So people are selected because of their skill at interrogation and all the other attributes, but that's the one single thing that separates the homicide guys from the others.
And what inspired you to write about that? I mean, you have a wonderful career behind you and some very interesting stories, but what in particular sent you down the writing path, which is not an easy path?
No, as you well know, yes. It's a lonely job and it's hard work, but I selected the one over my right shoulder, the Cold Case Squad, as the first in a trilogy involving a female character. Now, I wanted to create a female because there's so many books have been written about guys like me. Mm-hmm. It's kind of old. So I wanted to create a strong character who gets put down into this white, male white world where she has to earn her own way along the way, and she does. And finally, she ends up being successful and overcomes a great deal of problems that are thrown in her way. She's actually set up for failure, and she turns the whole thing around.
And this was your first one, Cold Case Squad. And what's her name?
Her name is Patricia McAvoy, but she likes to call herself Patty Mac. And she has well-educated. She has a background in law enforcement in that her father, late father, was the commanding officer of internal affairs. So she carries the cross of her father's victims, so to speak, still want to take revenge against her for what the dead man did to them. But she has a benefactor, and that is her late father's best friend is now a deputy commissioner. And for public relations reason, he plants her in the homicide squad as the first female supervisor. and then she has to make her own way and get through this very, very difficult case.
So tell us about the case.
All right, the case involves, as you can tell from the book cover, a young boy is found floating in the bay in that barrel. When he's pulled out, there is no identification on him. However, he has been strangled, and his hands are tied behind his back, and of course, it's a classic murder case. But it starts out with some difficulty because in these cases where you don't know who the victim is, you're kind of stalled right from the get-go. The terminology is it's a who is it rather than a who done it. So before you can get down the road, you've got to get him identified. In this case, as you'll find in all of the books I write about, the murderers made a mistake and left a small artifact in the boy's jeans change pocket. They missed it when they cleaned out his body, and the detectives are then able to go back and identify it, and through that, they identify him as an illegal Mexican immigrant who came here just a few years before that. He's only 16 or 17, but he wound up getting caught up with some bad people, and they murdered him. So she has to take that case, but before she gets to that, she has to make her bones. And the squad commander is not giving her anything to do. So finally he throws her a cold case squad, hence the name of the book. And she ends up taking a case that's been laying dormant for 5 years. It's a manslaughter case, and she turns that into a successful arrest. Now the thing about manslaughter, unlike murder, that is bound by the statute of limitations. So she also has to race against the clock in order to prosecute the murderer. So she successfully does that, and how her squad, her little squad of men, decide that she's pretty sharp and start to call her boss, which is an honorific term in police service, and from then on she's no longer a sergeant, she's the boss. And she begins to make her own way, and eventually gets to solve the case of the Mexican boy in the barrel.
And then you went on to the 12th protocol, which is also a Patty matter.
Yeah, what happens at the end of, we always want a good ending. And at the end of the cold case, she gets involved in a real battle royal with this squad commander who's corrupt and who's doing all kinds of illegal things just to make sure that his record is perfect. He wants to have all his homicide cases cleared, and he'll do anything to do it. Eventually, she has a battle with him and overcomes his criminality. As a result, she gets a spot promotion and becomes now, she's a detective lieutenant, the squad commander, and her next case is going to be the 12th protocol. Now, how I walked upon the 12th protocol, my daughter had just moved to Long Beach a few weeks before Sandy. So by the time we were able to get back to her place, which was not really badly damaged, she was lucky, it's just no power, National Guard. And in order to get to the place, I had to wait a while, and I looked at the boardwalk, and you can see from the condition of the book cover, that boardwalk was
destroyed.
It was destroyed. And I then had a talk with a friend of mine. He told me the significance of those benches on the boardwalk. They started out after 9/11. For the most part, families began to put benches as a memorial to their lost loved one. In some cases, it was their grave, because his bodies were never recovered from the World Trade Center, and they would go there and look out and everything else. So the reason the bench is in the book cover is because that involves another mistake made by the murderers. Now, while I was talking to my daughter, I looked and said, you know, what if somebody had murdered some people and buried their bodies under the boardwalk, and now the storm washed them up? So that's how this story was invented, just standing there with my hands in my pockets saying,
what if?
What if? And that's pretty much how it all began. And my friend about the benches, and before I knew it, I was typing away and created this story out of figment of my imagination. Now, the background to that one is it's a little bit tougher because we have to find out who the murderers were. There were several bodies under that boardwalk. that were washed up by Sandy. So through guile, ingenuity, and the help of her team, Patty now discovers who the victims were, because they were all dismembered, they were taken apart, and they came from a foreign country. But with a little bit of help, she finds out who the possible killers are. And they turn out to be rogue CIA paid-for Army veterans who are assigned to go around the world and pick up suspected terrorists and bring them overseas, or what they call a rendition, and take them to black sites in friendly countries for enhanced interrogation, a word we're all now familiar with.
Because we don't torture.
No, we don't. We enhance interrogation. However, for any of the viewers who ought to take a shot one day, just Google torture memos, and you'll come up with the actual things that Senator Dianne Feinstein just wrote about and exposed, that what was going on with the CIA. But I had already published the book before Feinstein went on the news.
Isn't that the significance of the title, the 12th Protocol? It has to do with interrogation, right?
No, it actually has to do with, in these torture memos, they outlined 11 things that are allowed to be done. Mm-hmm. And that includes the infamous waterboarding, standing up for long periods of time, cold cells, including putting people in what amounts to a coffin, and so on. Mm-hmm. So there were 11 of these things that these Department of Justice lawyers said were okay to do. But when you do something like that, there's no restriction on somebody else creating it. So this group of rogues created the 12th Protocol, and that was dismemberment, murder, everything else, just to get the job done. And what they decided to do, or the commander decided to do, was instead of spending all of his money on taking these people overseas with private jets and kidnappings and bribery, he would do it here on Long Island. So he set up a black site in Farmingdale, and he would do his torture there and then dispose of the bodies. There was a reason why they couldn't dispose of the bodies in a quick manner. They dumped them in Long Beach, and I explained that in the book. But for the other part, they would just take their victims upstate and dispose of the bodies on state property up there after dismembering them. But they were looking for information, and the bottom line was our government really didn't care how the information was gotten as long as it was gotten. And I explained some of the things that, I use the expression, more than one Hellfire missile was put in somebody's breakfast plate because of information that these guys came up with. But she brings the thing to a successful conclusion. It starts with the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy and doesn't really begin until that January when they were taking the boardwalk apart, and then these bodies were discovered. Shortly after that, if you remember, we had an infamous wild snowstorm, a blizzard in February, and she has to work through the blizzard to capture the bad guys, which she does. And she's successful again and gets the job done. Along the way, she does infuriate a few of her commanders, the senior management, because she tends to be a person of independent judgment. She likes to go it alone. And she knows that rather than ask for permission, she'd rather ask for mercy later on and just go ahead and do something without getting involved in the bureaucratic process.
That can be a very successful approach to problem solving.
It can be, but it also can be dangerous.
Move forward and ask questions later.
Yeah.
Before we get to Rampage,
Right.
Is there another Patty Mack coming down the pike?
Yes, there's a fourth book in the works now. It's called The Slaughter of the Innocent. And if I can just give a brief.
Yes, please.
A brief. In the protocol, in the cold case squad, her initial problem was that she had to get out of her workplace because her husband had betrayed her. She came upon him, and they both worked as detective sergeants in the same place. So she went to her late father's friend, and he puts her in homicide as a public relations ploy. But the origin of how she wound up there was her husband had pressured her and pressured her and pressured her into terminating a pregnancy that he wasn't ready for, didn't want, had no use for, and everything else, and she acquiesced to that. On her way home one night, she stopped in a place to visit the bathroom, and there's her husband and his girlfriend and their little girl celebrating their 3rd birthday together, and she was conceived at the time she was having her abortion. So she's carrying a tough road, and I mention it all throughout here because in the 12th protocol, some of the victims were children also, and she has a real antipathy toward people who kill children. So that doesn't happen in Rampage, but the next book I wrote is a pretty tough story because we had many of these where young women would end their pregnancy by killing the newborn. There's a psychological effect that they denied their pregnancy and everything. So what she does, she now engages in a war between Patty and the woman who killed her baby. It becomes a battle royal and a drama between the two of them.
But that's what makes these kinds of series that have a repetitive character. It's the character. You really have to develop a sympathy for the character, for the stories to really grab on to the reader, or for the reader to grab onto the story and read the next one, because they want to know what's happening to Patty Mac.
And one of the things that I've learned about repetitious characters, you can't assume that people read the first book. Mm-hmm. So you've got to repeat her travails throughout the books just to let the new readers know that this thing is a cross she's been carrying from day one, and she's very bitter about it. And, you know, all of our heroes are not flawless, and she's got flaws with this stuff.
Right, and you want those books to stand alone.
Yes.
So, because one topic will grab one reader, and another topic may not. But if they read one of them, they'll fall in love with the character and go on to the next.
Yeah. Well, some people who've read the books, I appreciate their honesty. They said she is a strong character who has to overcome, and she doesn't take any crap from anybody because she's got to make her way. She is in still a 99% male world, and so she's got to.
And police work is tough work.
Yes, it is tough work.
You're not always dealing, or I would say you're hardly ever dealing with the happy side of life.
No, you're not. Nobody comes to your house at 3 o'clock in the morning in uniform to tell you you've won the lottery.
No, it's true.
It's bad news.
So tell us about Rampage, because this is true.
Well,
this is true crime.
This one is based on a true crime. Back in Memorial Day weekend of 1982, 5 thugs from Brooklyn who had visited Long Island before and referred to it as Babylonia, the land of milk and honey. They operated on one thing and one thing alone. Whatever they saw or whatever they wanted, they would take. And if you got in their way, you would get shot, beaten, blackjacked, or any other thing. If they wanted your watch, it was going. They lived almost, well, as I tell the story, you'll start to see similarities between them and ISIS and all these other terrorist groups today. But in any event, they come out of a precinct in Brooklyn where, and you got to give credit to the cops. If you remember, there's a radio station that used to say, give us 22 minutes and we'll give you the world. Well, the cops in that precinct said, give us 22 minutes and we'll give you a murder. So that's how much crime there was in that environment that they grew up with. My co-author in this case, his daughter was involved in this case. So let me give you the background. These guys start out in Brooklyn because they need a stolen car, a Cadillac. They like caddies. And they go to a garage and they beat the garage attendants and some people who are working there and playing some dice and poker, and they relieve them of all their money and all of their jewelry and everything else. And they pile in the Cadillac and they head out to Long Island. They stop at a house on the Nassau-Suffolk border and they commit absolute random mayhem. They go in there and they rape, they rob, they beat, and they loot the place. And before they leave, they had hogtied the family. The family, the adults, were just supervising their college-age children who had come home from their first year of college and were having a little bit of a reunion. So there were several young people in the house. Now the parents are hogtied, and the father hears fluid being poured all around the house, and he thinks they're going to set the place on fire. They're not, because finally the son makes it up the stairs, and he says, "What was all that water and stuff?" He goes, "Oh, that's when they urinated on my friends' backs." So, but the mistake, there's always a mistake, in the stolen Cadillac, these guys had to make room for some loot they wanted to take from the house. And in those days, televisions were big boxy things. So out of the trunk came the spare tire, the flares, and the jack, and all of that stuff, plus a coat. It's thrown on the lawn, and inside goes the loot, and they head off to their third spot of the night. But there comes a time when a sharp sergeant picks up the coat and looks inside, and there's the registration for the car. So now we know where it came from. But in the meantime, before that can get worked on, where are they? They're heading to the diner, the Seacrest Diner in Old Westbury. And unfortunately for the diner, it had two things. It was near the entrance to the Northern State Parkway, which would take them back to Grand Central,
To
Brooklyn. And it also had the unfortunate, it had what they call church windows, leaded glass. So one of the guys in the car goes, they can't see out and nobody can see in. So on that, they decide that they're going to hit the place. Now, my co-author, Mr. Renard, his daughter went to work that night as a college student. It was her first night of work. And he sought me out to help him write this particular book, which I was glad to do. But the story involving his daughter is a great anecdote, because his mother then calls him up to complain. "Why are you letting my granddaughter go to work in a diner at night?" He says, "Ma, it's Old Westbury, the richest, safest community on Long Island. What could happen?" Well, he lived with that question for the rest of his life. He still shakes his head about it for now.
So what happened in the diner?
So in the diner, we get a repetition of what went on in the house, but even more so because there's a lot more people here, and there's a lot more loot, and there are people raped, shot, beaten, multiple beatings all over the place. And the reason we selected the lightning bolt is to show that that kind of crime now can happen anywhere to anyone at any time. And the man with the gun, the shotgun, is the guy. To paraphrase Mao Zedong, all power comes out of the barrel of a gun. And it did. It intimidated the people. And they went through the ritual of robbing them. And then at one point, this guy decides that he's going to have everybody undress and start to have simulated sex with each other and everything else. And he's running around, jumping on a table, fires a shotgun into the ceiling. And of course, people eventually have to do that, unwilling, and because of the conglomeration of people, some people wound up with strangers next to them. And the guys are promising, "I'm not going to do anything, just sit there and be quiet." And then people are mumbling, "Where are the police? Where are the police?" But no police came. They were in there 1 solid hour, which is a long time, a long time.
That is a long time.
And they intimidated everyone, looted the place top to bottom. But in the meantime now, as I talked about earlier, sometimes the great detectives are just great. In this case, Andy Towner was a robbery squad detective at the time, a former Army private who went into Vietnam as a private and came out as a Ranger captain, a very special guy. He's at the house in Plainview, and he starts to reminisce about how the Viet Cong used to use Laos as a kind of refuge. And he sees now Brooklyn is their refuge, and he's going to go in after them. So he assembles on his own, no rank, just a detective, and he says to his collected group of friends, he says, "We have handcuffs, they have wrists, let's go get them." And he does. And He does one other thing, which bright guys do. Instead of putting out an alarm to NYPD to be on the lookout for this caddy for an armed robbery, which it was at that point, he changed it to murder, so that the fellows in the Brooklyn precincts who are more accustomed to murder might get the attention rather than just another armed robbery, which they might compare to shoplifting, or, you know. So, and he did that, and a sergeant on patrol with his driver found the stolen caddy in Bushwick that morning. Simultaneously, this bunch is coming out with their little paper bags to go sell all their loot from the night before in someplace, a secondhand store, and they get caught.
Well,
for the most
they get
part.
caught, but there is also, because we don't have too much time left,
Right.
but there is also a kicker to the end of this story, isn't there?
Well, there's several kickers. The worst of the kicker is the magnitude of the crimes that these guys committed. They should have all gotten 3,000 years apiece. But because of a quirk in sentencing laws at the time, 3 of them only got 15 to 30. They were officially let out after 20. The other 2, however, had committed a murder earlier prior to this night of Rampage. So they got sentenced to 25 to life plus the 15 to 30. So the end result was the law was changed, some justice was done, but 3 of them are out on the street right now to do whatever they want.
So you've done a wonderful job of bringing police work and some interesting cases, and I'm glad that you're going to continue with this.
Yes.
We're looking forward to the 3rd Patty Mac, and certainly, do you have anything you would like to say to writers or readers?
As I mentioned earlier, it's not something that's a piece of cake. You're going to have to sit down in a lonely spot and do a lot of research. Thank God for the internet and Wikipedia. I can't imagine having to go to the library now to look things up.
No.
But you've really got to give it a lot of thought. You've got to write, and then edit, and then do it all over again. So it is a lonely, tough job, and I'm blessed with the fact that I know how to type properly, but a lot of my contemporaries don't. They have to handwrite it and give it to somebody to type. So there are all kinds of impediments to getting this done. But if you make up your mind, put black ink on white paper,
Thanks, John.
it's done.